and don't want to live in Brampton. And my sister's a teacher, so she talks a lot about that experience, about, you're teaching kids in a community. She lives in Brampton. She loves Brampton. And so when she's relating to the kids, she finds it very different from teachers who have intentionally chosen not to live in Brampton and are now like, oh, these kids or the school. There's certainly like a perception about Brampton that's negative. And that keeps, teachers, police officers, very few Peel police officers actually live in Brampton. And these are all things that, contribute to the way people are treated in the city as well, I think.
That's interesting. So that's another thing I want to sort of look at is what is the makeup of all these kind of public services?
Yeah.
And does it reflect its population? I'm talking to a teacher who's lived in Brampton. She's actually white, and she's lived in Brampton her whole life, and now she teaches at the school she went to. So I think that'll be kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, ask her about her, other teachers' comments, because I have heard that teachers often make comments about Brampton kids and make, sort of a differentiation between, if you teach at Mayfield, which, while in Brampton is, more Caledon kids, that's where more of the teachers are willing to go if they're going to teach in Brampton. But it's often harder to get teachers to come to some of the other Brampton schools.
And so do you have kids?
I have a 9-year-old, and then I've had 2 teenagers come to me by various means. So I have one. She's not a teenager anymore, but she's 20. Yeah.
And do they all live with you?
So the 20-year-old is in and out, so she travels and does things, and the 8-year-old, or I guess he's 9 now, he lives with us, obviously. And then I have my foster son is about 22, and he lives on his own now.
And and please don't take any offense to this, it's related to the story. What's your particular background?
Yeah. So I was born in Canada, and both of my parents are American for many generations back.
Okay.
So,
cool.
Yeah.
So one thing that I think is super interesting about Fold in particular is that it's not. I think that there are some cultural offerings that really target people who have just arrived, from the Bollywood film nights in Garden Square, which actually could be fun for a lot of people. I'm not going to say this just for but it's kind of the obvious thing that people think about. And when I learned about the Fold, and I wanted to come so badly this year, and I had to work, but I think it's such an interesting iteration of what a diverse community needs.
Yeah.
And I'm interested to hear about where the idea came from and what really pushed you to make it happen.
Yeah. So I had a book come out in 2012, and when the book was coming out, my publisher told me, this is going to do really well. It'll probably win awards. You'll get invited to festivals because it's so unique. The book was about my father was the first Black quarterback to win the Grey Cup. And so I wrote a memoir about his life and about my experiences growing up Black in Canada. So there were stories about going to my high school and being the only Black American Canadian, as opposed to Caribbean Canadian or African Canadian. And also stories about learning about the Civil Rights Movement and what my dad had been through and all this stuff. So I had sort of cleared out my life to go to all these festivals and do all these things. And the book came out and nothing happened, and nothing happened. I wasn't.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Really invited to festivals, and there's this moment where you're you don't. Maybe the book isn't good, right? You just sort of start to think
awful.
And there's a realistic evaluation that has to happen whenever a book comes out, and that sort of takes place. But I also, at that time, I was trying to realistically evaluate the writing and the book, and I was getting lots of great feedback from readers. And I was looking at literary festivals and going to them just as an attendee, and I started to see really troubling sort of patterns, where most of the speakers were white, where all of the workshop leaders were white. I went to a workshop once where on dialogue, the workshop leader used a scene where two white folks were talking about their black maid and calling her a Negro. And I mean, it was like appropriate for the setting, but it was very uncomfortable. I was the only black person in the room, and they never talked about the context or what that meant. They just were talking about the dialogue as though it was just like two people talking about what they're going to have for dinner. Right. And I started to realize that when people of color were called upon, they were being called upon to talk specifically about diversity and never about the craft of writing or how they created their characters or how they wrote dialogue. And so I wanted to start a festival that did that gave diverse writers from backgrounds, experiences, anyone who's like marginalized, not typically represented, a space to be like the expert. And I also was living in Brampton. I was living in downtown Brampton, and I felt like, the city needed something there that could put it on the map in the literary community, but also just putting it on the map in general. Right. I wanted to be able to have people come into Brampton from outside of Brampton and experience what I really loved about, especially the downtown community of Brampton. So that's really where it came about. It was to serve two purposes: to really create a space that was needed in the literary community, but also to make Brampton like a central location for a major event. All the events that happened in Brampton prior to that, for the most part, were for the Brampton community. I mean, Celebrate Brampton, Ribbon Roll, like all these things that are sort of the big highlights for a lot of Bramptonians are all about Brampton, for Brampton. And I wanted it to be people coming to Brampton for something else.
And how many years has it been running now?
So we did 3. I've been planning it for 5 years, working on it for 5 years, and we've done 3 festivals so far. So the first one was 2016. Right.
And what was kind of like, when you held the first one, what was kind of the highlight for you in the very first? I mean, I'm sure the whole thing was like.
Yeah, no. There's so in the very first year, I think the challenge when you're doing something new is you have this idea, but you're not really sure if it's like actually going to work or make any difference. So there were 2 highlights. One, I think that is relevant to you in this article is our opening session was on a book called Subdivided. And the book, so the book is this anthology of essays about building better cities, right, and really thinking about cities from a different perspective. And I thought it was a really great because it showed us one of the things we wanted to do was to make the event interesting to non-readers as well, to find spaces where people could come and just get information and insight that would make a difference, even if they wouldn't necessarily consider themselves like avid readers. And so that certainly was a big deal to us to open that way. But I think at the end of the festival, I remember my colleague coming downstairs and just in my house and just being sort of in tears, and just sort of saying, like, I think something really magical happened this weekend. And I think that was one of the highlights, is just that overwhelming sense that this is different and that by doing it different, there's actually like a tangible difference in the experience. It's not just I go to IFOA or I go to Vancouver Writers Fest and then I go to the Fold and it's all kind of the same. There's definitely the feeling that something different happens at Fold. And I would say for like most people who come, they make that comment all 3 years. But certainly the first year, that was the most sort of unexpected. I don't think I really expected it to be such a noticeable difference for everybody.
I mean, I think even not in my opinion, not in this, kind of. But I think even looking at the lineup, when I was like looking at the lineup this year, and unfortunately I wasn't able to come, I was like, I just recognized so many more people. Yeah. And I think that's a function of like who I am and what I pay attention to. Do you know what I mean? And so it's like, it was just a more appealing festival. Like,
it's funny because I think that's something that I've always noticed. Like, I try to tell people who program festivals, like, I literally will open the program for a festival and look at the faces or the names and be like, yeah, I'm coming, or no, I'm not interested. And it's a very, it's probably not the most thoughtful approach generally. Like, you do have to do a little bit of digging, but sometimes for me, it's like, if I don't see a number of people of color, to me, you haven't done the basic effort. Like, not even getting into